We in the Forward Together movement believe that we are in a moral crisis that is trying to take America down the road to political deconstruction. But there is a path to higher ground. There is a better way. To grasp why many of us believe we are in a moral crisis, we need to glance into history for a moment to find an interpretive lens. We need to understand, like this conference, the roots and the networkings of immoral deconstruction. And the only way to do that, we must find ourselves for a moment all the way back to the movement against slavery and the movement that was designed to deal with the vestiges of slavery. Remember, if you will, in the 1800s, 1868, there arose a movement to build a new South. It was called the Fusion Movement, the moral fusion movement. And it led what was called the first Reconstruction. In that moment, in North Carolina, for instance, forging together, they created a path to higher ground by framing a vision of reconstructing the nation along our deepest moral values. Back then, 146 years ago, blacks and whites came together in the South, and they understood the fusion between lifting up the former slaves and how it intersected with the preservation of the South and the nation. Now, this Reconstruction wasn't perfect, but walk with me for a minute and hear with me for a minute the kind of language they used to rewrite constitutions, to frame this movement and navigate the nation forward. Listen for a minute, if you will, at the language not used in 1960 or 1990 or 2000, but 146 years ago, for instance, in North Carolina. This is how black and whites were talking about coming up out of the vestiges of slavery. This is what they wrote in our Constitution. We the people of the state of North Carolina, grateful to Almighty God, the sovereign ruler of nations, for the preservation of the American Union and the existence of our civil, political, and religious liberties. Listen what they say. We hold it to be self-evident that all persons are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. That's 146 years ago. That's language that didn't even make it into our Constitution, federally. Then they wrote, Article 2, all political power is vested in and derived from the people and should be used only for the good of the whole. 146 years ago, they wrote, Section 10, all elections shall be free. 146 years ago. Section 11, all political rights and privileges are not dependent upon or modified by property. No property qualification shall affect the right to vote or hold office. 146 years ago, they knew how bad it was to let money drive who runs for political office. Section 12 said the people have a right to assemble, and then they said, but secret political societies are dangerous to the liberties of a free people. 146 years ago, they knew the danger of lobbyists that go into back rooms and dictate policy. Section 15, 146 years ago, they made education a constitutional right in the South. The people have a right to public education, and the state must guard that right. Section 16 demanded that everybody be provided equal protection. Section 19, equal protection under the law. And then Article 11, 146 years ago, when blacks and whites built this fusion movement, they wrote this in the Constitution. Listen, Article 11, Section 4. Beneficent provision for the poor, the unfortunate, and the orphan is one of the first duties of a civilized and Christian state. is 6 years ago. When we look at the state of our crisis today, in 1868, we see this moral, say moral, fusion, language. And it formed a framework for reconstruction. Here's what they fought for with this fusion movement: voting rights, public education, labor, health care, equal protection, fair tax policy, good of the whole. And that kind of agenda reshaped the South. And it reshaped the country. It reshaped the world. But it also brought a vicious backlash. A group came to being and they called themselves the Tea Party. In 1868, a group arose that called themselves the Redemption Movement. And it was rooted in the extreme philosophy of immoral deconstruction. And they fought back. They were moved by fear. Fear that their world was being taken over. Fear of a more just society. Fear of a more perfect union. They were radical racists and began a process of immoral deconstruction. They began a campaign of fear and divide. They called themselves heretically the Redemption Movement. Sounds nice, but what they meant by that was it's time for us to redeem America from the problem of black and white people working together for justice. What did they attack first? Voting rights. Then they attacked public education. Then they attacked labor. Then they attacked fair tax policies. Then they attacked progressive leaders. And then they engaged in a plan 100 some years ago to take over the courts, state and federal, so that they could be used in the service of rendering rulings that undermined the hopes of a new America that ended with Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And then they led riots all over this country and tried to make sure that certain elements had guns so that they could put the country back in its place according to their deconstructive, immoral philosophy. From this history, my friends, we must understand the root of what we're seeing. We learned that the strategy to stop any effort at reconstruction, the strategy to stop fusion movement has always consisted of these 5 or 6 direct attacks. You attack voting rights, you attack tax revenue and government programs and agencies designed to promote social uplift. You attack labor rights. You attack public education policy. You attack, you attack or assassinate or try to undermine white and black progressive leaders. Then we get to the second reconstruction. I'm passing a lot of history, but bear with me. In 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education decision had an indelible impact on the United States. Declared the case of the century. It established that intentional segregation was unconstitutional, and this ruling served to fuel the civil rights movement. 2 things fueled the civil rights movement: the Brown decision and the acquittal of the people that killed Emmett Till. Because when Rosa Parks saw them be acquitted, it was then that she decided, in response to the acquittal of the murderers of Emmett Till, she had to sit down and challenge the existing system of discrimination. With this new fusion of blacks, and now whites, and now women, and now Latinos, and now the LGBT community like Bayard Rustin and others, all coming together, what did we see? We saw affirmative action. We saw the Committee on Equal Employment. We saw civil rights connected morally to economic justice. We saw the Social Security amendments of 1965. We saw the creation on a moral basis of Medicare and Medicaid. We saw changes in the application of Social Security that allowed the domestic community and the agrarian community that had been left out in 1935. We saw the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And President Johnson said on August 6, 1965, that the Voting Rights Act was a triumph of freedom as huge as any victory that's ever been won on any battlefield. But the law came months after Martin Luther King launched the Southern Coalition Leadership Conference in Selma, when people of all different faiths came together, all different colors, and demanded from a moral perspective that the nation needed to change. So this moral fusion politics gained tremendous ground in the Second Reconstruction. But then, as in the 1800s, the transformative power of moral-based fusion politics once again came under attack. This time, the attacks were defined and developed by Kevin Phillips, a Nixon and Republican strategist who came to be known as the White Southern Strategy. It was a strategy deliberately designed to play the race card in a way to drive Southern whites to vote their fears and not their future, but it was designed to play the race card without seeming racist. You remember when GOP strategist Lee Atwater boldly described the Southern strategy? You all have seen it out on Google and everywhere. But he said, you know, we couldn't use the N-word anymore, not in 64, 65. He said, you can't be overtly racist. It'll backfire. So you say stuff like forced busing and states' rights and all that stuff, he said. He said, you get abstract. You talk about cutting taxes and all these things you're talking about. They seem to be totally economic, but the byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites, and we are able to divide the country. The target of the Southern strategy was all of the southern states of the old Confederacy, but also some of the suburbs of the North. It was the goal of developing a solid South to ensure that the majority of Southern whites would resist and repeal any fusion political and moral alliances with African Americans and others. Programs that were once popular became the focus of great dislike and were castigated as negative entitlements, helping those undeserving people. Voting rights and civil rights laws were seen as further intrusion on the sovereignty of the state, especially in southern states. And the process to no longer allow issues such as addressing poverty and civil rights to be defined in the public square as moral issues were begun in earnest, with the goal of limiting the moral discourse in the public square to abortion, prayer in the school, and your stance on homosexuality. Even though those things do not even make up the primary or the preeminent ethical or moral concerns of any moral religion. Let's get to the root of this thing. Leaders of the progressive moral vision were attacked. Some were killed. Medgar killed. Martin killed. Kennedy killed. Bobby killed. The movement was depressed. It worked. It solidified. And according to a recent article in the Times, Charles Koch in 1974 delivered a speech on how to build a massive infrastructure. Not to promote particular candidates, but to recreate the social consciousness and to promote his brand of immoral deconstruction and how it would work. And Ronald Reagan used it to the teeth. In 1980, when he began part of his presidential campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Didn't have to be overtly racist, but he by being there and by using all the code words of the white Southern strategy, he locked up the South. So when we look at the ebbs and the flows and the lessons and the vision of these two periods, the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction, some of us believe that the current struggle before us now is a sign of the time that we are in the middle of the struggle for a third Reconstruction in this nation. The same attacks we saw in the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction. The attack on voting rights, the attack on fair tax policy, the attack on public education, the attack on labor rights, the attack on women, the attack on LGBT rights, the attack on immigrants' rights. The attacks are a sign that we have the possibility of a third Reconstruction if we don't give up and understand what is at stake. And how do I know again? Is because the movement in some ways was signaled by the 2008 election of President Obama. Now, it wasn't so much the president, as powerful and as hopeful as we've been about that, but what signaled that we were in the possibility of a third Reconstruction was the emergence of a new majority electorate, especially in southern states. North Carolina is now 23% African American, 3 to 4% Latino, that's 27%. That means you only need about 24% of whites to vote their future, not their field. Mississippi is 33% African American. That means and you add Latinos, that means you only need about 15 to 16% of whites in the South in Mississippi to vote their future, not their field. Similarly in Georgia, the campaign, President Obama, not to be partisan, but to be historical, used some of the elements of fusion politics that were used in the 1800s and in the 1960s. In North Carolina, before he ever ran, we had a movement, the Forward Together movement, that had already changed voting laws before he was on the ballot, that had won same-day registration and early voting and Sunday voting. We challenged even Democrats, and we won. And because of that, we opened up the possibility for a broad new electorate. And when President Obama won that state, won some southern states, that new electorate revealed the potential of a new fusion majority, one that directly challenges the white southern strategy and that scares the daylights of those who want to stay stuck in the past. But watch what happened. In both the first and the second Reconstruction, it took the extremists more than a decade to mount an effective reaction. With Obama's election and the electorate, the extremists said no, not just to him, but even before the man was inaugurated, they were saying no to the possibility of this new fusion politics. So now we have a political extremist, immoral deconstruction effort called by whatever name you want to call it, Tea Party, Coke Money Puppets, whatever you want to call it. It's an immoral agenda of deconstruction. We need a few bloggers to tell them, y'all ain't fooling nobody. We know American history too well. And every now and then we need to not, as my grandmother said, be so deep. But just explain what their agenda is. And clear. Here's their agenda. Here's their agenda. This is their agenda. They are saying, these extremists, if you want a great America, here's the path to a great America. Deny public education and attack teachers. Undermine public funding of public education, give it to private schools. You want a great America? Here's the extremist view. Deny health care and Medicaid expansion. Leave millions of poor people uninsured. Deny earned income tax credit. Deny unemployment. Deny labor rights. Deny LGBT rights. Deny women's rights. Deny immigrants' rights and hold vicious rally against immigrant children when most of you come from immigrants yourself. Cut more taxes for the wealthy and then declare you don't have money for critical investments in America's infrastructure and in programs that uplift America. And then, here's their agenda. Tell your neighbor, this is their whole agenda. And whenever you know your agenda can't survive, if America really wants to be great, then engage in the worst form of voter suppression since Jim Crow. And then if you really want to have a great nation, tell every lie you can about the president, call him everything but an American and a child of God, refuse to pass anything just because you don't like little black girls having pajama parties in the White House. Fight even his wife when she just wants children to eat healthy vegetables. And then, if you really want a great America, after you have flamed and blown on the fires of racial and class and national hatred, you want a really good America, make sure everybody can get a gun and make it easier to get a gun and to vote. Deconstructionist agenda.